Okay, so if anybody has any questions, if you'd like to put them in the question and answer part, we'll leave Judith to look after them. I'm going to leave you now.
And then welcome everybody who came to this question and answer session, and I'm happy to receive any questions you might have, or just have a chat about any of the issues that inspired you, or you have thoughts or reflections about. Right, okay, Mark, when do we reduce the support to prepare students for the real world? That's a tricky question, because I'm not sure if we need to be thinking about this question in this particular way. I think first of all, our primary aim should be to help and support students so that they succeed in school. Because very often, if they fail in school, that cuts them off from a lot of real life opportunities, progress to university, certain jobs. So my priority would be to make sure that the students succeed in school, and then I think we might want to start thinking about not necessarily reducing support, but teaching students how to support themselves and how to find the strategies that they can use to support themselves. So a bit like the Vygotsky model of learning, where you have teacher support, and then students can move on to support from other media objects, tools, perhaps peers. And then finally, becoming autonomous. It's a long process, but also we have to recognize that some of these students might actually need support outside school as well, and it's really important that employers are aware of specific learning difficulties students need, what barriers there are in employment. For students and or for individuals with specific learning difficulties, and how those barriers can be removed from the environment and the workplace. So that's my answer. I hope that helps. Let me. Okay, well, I don't know, Mark. I mean, I can see your chat as well at 60 plus. Again, I think our primary aim should be to support the students in our context as much as we can, and then teach them to how to use tools, how to advocate for themselves in the workplace, or at university, how they can access different support systems, etc. Okay, let me move back to the question and answers. Okay, so Sue's question, phonological processing, in what way is that relevant to helping? So phonological processing is something that students who have specific learning difficulties often have challenges with. And it is particularly relevant at early stages of language learning and also for young learners, because phonological processing predicts word-level reading comprehension. Phonological processing plays less important role when students progress with reading, because then reading becomes less centered around words and sentences, but reading involves higher order reading processes, such as making connections between ideas, in making inferences, predicting, etc. So students who are not, for example, very severely dyslexic, once we move away from, you have to read out every word accurately and you have to read at speed, they can be pretty good at reading comprehension. They might just be slower readers. So for them, actually developing their phonological processing skills may not bring a lot of benefits, because they are not dealing with short text, with sentence level comprehension anymore. But with young children, we can do a lot to train how do you recognize differences between sounds, particularly in English, sounds that are not part of your native language repertoire. How do you manipulate sounds? What happens if I leave out the first sound of a word, like what becomes of cat, if I leave out cat, k from cat, what happens? Or if I move a sound somewhere else. So you can train this. This is particularly useful at early stages, or if you are working with bilingual English as an additional language learners. You can train their phonological awareness, and then you can help them with word level decoding and relatively simple reading. It's not a solution to all the challenges that the students will have, because if you remember from my talk, they do have challenges in other areas. So that's that. It's a useful strategy for certain types of students, and it might be also a useful strategy for adult learners at the very beginning of their language learning, especially if for example, they come from a very different literacy environment with low literacy, refugees, immigrants, for example. Phonological awareness training might be really helpful for them as well. So I hope, Sue, that answers your question. I can see more people join the room, so feel free to put your questions in either in the Q&A or... Oh, hi, Harry.
Hello. Sorry, I had technical issues getting in, but fine that I'm in now. So
good. Luckily, I didn't have any issues, so that's good.
Yeah, I've been listening to you in the background, and great to see that we've got a few more people who've just joined. I think you've answered the 2 questions already. If there were any other questions, can you put them in the Q&A, please? But I would also look at the chat box to see if there are any other questions that people might have posted. Oh, no.
Yeah, let me know. Or share any ideas, any experiences, reflections, or future plans you might want to take. Or just tell me what you would like to know more about. More people joining. Feel free to post your questions in the...
Yeah. Or just any comment, please.
Oh, yes, comments. And if you give me a prompt, I can easily talk for hours about inclusive language teaching. Just let me know what you're interested in. And,
well, okay, Judith, personally, I just wanted to come back to what you said about integration and inclusion, because that's something I personally struggle with, because very often what I see as integration sometimes is brandished as inclusion. So maybe just highlighting that again in terms of special education needs, but more in terms of the bigger ideas about inclusion in society and integration. What might that look like?
yeah, I agree with you, Harry. I think very often, inclusion is a process. It's not a final stage. And I think, educational institutions and educational regulations requires schools, for example, and universities to become inclusive spaces. But very often we see, that the responsibility is put on the students who are diverse in one way or another to adapt to the system without asking the students what it is that they would need or once you have drawn up their individual learning plans. For example, at the university, students arrive and they have individual learning plans, and some support is put into place. I think what is a shame is that that doesn't get reassessed very often, and students, for example, when they start at school or university, they don't know what it is that they will need in extra to what they have been offered. And I have been in these shoes as an academic advisor, finding out that the students would actually need more support than was originally offered. And then there are all kinds of institutional barriers when you want to go back and say, look, and it was actually me who had to propose this adjustment to the student, because the student wasn't aware that this was possible. And if it hadn't been me, who is an experienced teacher in inclusion, I'm not sure if others would have thought about it. So I think there is, it's always the job of teachers, students, parents, and so on, and it should be an ongoing dialogue if someone has diverse needs, and also kind of a soul searching exercise, looking into in what ways we can make our schools more inclusive, and how we can make some small changes that take us, for example, a very long way. So yeah, I agree.
Mark's question was interesting, though, the idea about when we reduce the support to prepare students for the real world. And I'm just wondering, what is the real world like for people with learning disabilities? Is it the real world like our world?
I think it's our word. I mean, we all share the same word, and I think we shouldn't make a distinction between school and real world, because the two. I mean, the schools are part of the real world, and students function outside the school as well. They might do extracurricular activities. They might attend, religious schools, or like the Polish school in the UK where they learn Polish, etc. So it's they might have part-time jobs. So I think we shouldn't also distinguish the real world from necessarily from our school system, and yeah, there is no clear point when we should reduce. I mean, our aim is to make sure that the students become autonomous and they know their strengths, they know their weaknesses, and support them in that process.
And there comes Sue again. Do you think that some teachers treat a class rather than individuals?
Yes, I mean, we always say, we teach a class, but the class is made up of individuals, and I know it's not always easy to think about individuals, and I never forget when I mean, I teach in an MAT Soul distance course, which was distance before the pandemic, and we had one student from Uganda, and we were discussing communicative language teaching and class sizes, and we were thinking, okay, a class of 40 is huge, and he said, no, a class of 40 is not huge. A class of 120 is huge, and again, I know that that it's difficult to get to know your students, even in this online environment, when some of the students are shy or anxious. I don't get to know all of them, unfortunately. So yeah, we should try to teach individuals, or at least, and if we cannot do that because we have so many students and it seems technically impossible, then we need to think about, okay, what it is that we can do in a more inclusive way, so that those who are maybe not forthcoming with their individual needs would benefit from.
That's interesting though, because my experience, I had the same experience when I was doing my MA. Students were talking about 40 students in a classroom as a large class, but I was coming from an experience of teaching between 147 and 232 young people in a classroom. So 40 was a small class. What I did was simply map out my class. I think it's Fawzia Shamin who talks about the action zone. I can tell when I get into a large class exactly the general patterns that would happen in the classroom, those who are sitting at the back and those who are sitting in the middle and at the front. And I start mapping out patterns of behaviors. I break the class into 5 or 6 boxes, and I observe groups in the classroom. And you can pick out character traits and patterns, and that helps me begin to get what I call the ringleaders in a positive and in a negative way. And those help me to then get to know individual students in their groups. But that's it for me. Maybe we should.
I mean, there is it Richard Smith at Warwick who wrote a really good resource on, or he co-authored or edited with British Council on teaching large classes in other resource context. So if you Google for it, if anyone is from that context, you can find that really useful. And obviously, it's more challenging in some contexts.
Yeah. Julie says, on that note, Judith, I love the way you encourage teachers to become proactive and to include inclusive strategies, even if their institution isn't doing it or hasn't provided formal structures. So I think that's more like a compliment, comment, a really positive comment. And Mark is asking that clearly some of the adjustments would work well for all students, but there may be others that slow neurotypical students. How much research has been done into possible negative effects of inclusion?
Right. Well, I don't think, I mean, there is a discussion whether inclusion has a negative effect on the performance of other students. And I think all the systematic research in this area has found that there is no negative effect whatsoever on the academic progress of other students. And if you want to look at one kind of nationwide experiment is Finland, where actually they are doing really well in all the PISA tests, etc., and they have a very inclusive school system. What I think, slow students, slow neurotypical students, yes, they do exist, and again, what I was trying to also say in my plenary is that we have a variety of student needs, and just to cite one piece of research that I didn't talk about today, that what we looked at how the timing of a reading test with the support of the British Council with the IATEFL test has affected students' performance. And we timed how long students took to do the reading test component of the IATEFL test. And in each class, we found 1 or 2 students who went over the allotted test time. And very interestingly, none of them had a diagnosis of specific learning difficulties. So maybe they could have been dyslexic or neurodiverse, and they were not identified. Or B, in every population there is a bell curve distribution. Sorry, it's very hot here, so apologies. So there is this bell curve distribution in terms of speed of processing, and we can have slow students. And yeah, that's why adjusting the pace of our teaching is important. Let me check if there is anything in the... Harry, you're muted. I don't know.
I'm muted. I'm sorry. It happens all the time with technology. You mute yourself, and then you forget.
Typical Zoom conversation.
Yeah. Mark has just made a quick comment in the chat box that is just trying to be sure that information is rigorous. Okay. He says, in the past, we used to separate neurodiverse students from mainstream. Should we do the reverse now and separate gifted students more?
Sorry, where is this question?
No, this is in the chat, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment on this because I've actually been in schools in the UK here, and while I was growing up, more recently, but also when I was growing up in my home country in Cameroon, and students were either separated in two different classes, and you could tell that those in class A were much more performant than class B, or inside the class, as is the case here. I remember working, volunteering in a school in Coventry, and this little boy I was supporting in their reading development tells me, Harry, you know what? Mrs. Sawota thinks I'm very stupid. That's why she puts me on the red table when it's reading time. So she thinks I can't read. So the children know that they're being moved around tables. We call them, tables might be called by animal names or by colors or whatever, but the children know that that's exactly what the teacher is telling them, that they're not good enough. So is that something you think should be done when we're thinking about inclusivity, especially with children with learning difficulties?
Well, I think Mark's question is a good one, because actually if you read journals on special educational needs, gifted students are included because they also have a special educational needs. You need to cater for their talents and make sure that they are also appropriately challenged and they can fulfill their potential in the area that they are talented in. I mean, I'm not really a big proponent of streaming students in any way. I think gifted students can also be supported and encouraged to develop in an inclusive classroom. So I wouldn't be for separation of students into gifted and non-gifted categories in any way. Educational research shows that the later the separation takes place based on academic abilities, the better the progress of students is on a national level. So educational systems where streaming, for example, in secondary schools happens at the latest possible stage are the most effective. And of course, there is some natural streaming embedded in our educational systems, because in the UK, they go to grammar school, they take the 11+ test, you know, in my home country, Hungary, they go to grammar school very early on, even at the age of 10. Yeah, I wouldn't be for it. I don't think it's actually beneficial for everybody, but it gives a lot of responsibility for the students, for the teachers, and the problem is that teachers are not very well trained in this regard. And I mean, it is difficult for teachers to deal with this spectrum. But we have, if you go onto the Engage website, we have a lot of proposals for differentiation, how you can differentiate tasks, how you can differentiate outcomes, how do you differentiate the process. And I taught this material in the autumn term in Vienna to my in-service teacher trainer group, and they asked exactly the same question: how can I do it? And then I, put them in groups, and I said, okay, now each of you takes one skill, one language skill. You look at the differentiation tips and come back with specific ideas how you can do this without spending hours to prepare, preparing 100 different worksheets without, making a big fuss in the classroom. And it was surprising that how many tips they came back with that were very easily implementable in their language teaching. So I would really recommend anyone who is interested to look at the Engage, the digital the digital task bank that I was talking about in my plenary, because it has a teacher training module, and one module on that is on differentiation. And we have very down-to-earth practical tips, what you can do and then you can try to introduce them. And of course, again, they may not work with 120 students, but as I said at the end of my plenary, just start small, and try out different things at a time.
Great, thank you, Judith. Any other comments? Any questions? We are monitoring both the chat box and the.
I can try. While we are talking, I'll put up the Engage link if anybody.
Yeah. We've got 5 more minutes, so we can look at the link.
I put it in the chat. That's the teacher training program, and also in the Q&A. Well, I put it in Ask a Question. It's not a question, but this is the link to the teacher training program. And I was using it with the students online, and they loved it, the in-service teachers. So I hope you will find some interesting ideas there.
Would you say there are particular differences when we're dealing with different age groups, especially with much younger learners in a language classroom? You know, more and more now we're experiencing this mad rush for early English language education, and children as young as 3 in some places, parts of the world, or say 5, 6 in first years of primary schooling are being exposed to English, and many of them would have these issues. Do you think that there would be what would be the differences in approaching very young learners as opposed to maybe teenage and older learners?
Yes, I mean, there are some differences between younger learners and older students, and I think you really need to think about when you start very early English teaching in a foreign language context, you have to think about how useful it is, and that's another debate. And we know that the early start doesn't necessarily result in better outcomes, and some students who have dyslexia, particularly issues around phonological processing, they might feel really confused by very early start in language learning. So you really have to be careful with very early start. But as I said earlier, the phonological awareness raising activities are clearly useful. Playing with sounds, playing with words, playing with stories are very helpful for younger students. Whereas if you have adult students, for example, who are literate in their own language already, you probably wouldn't do it. There are lots of multisensory methods which are helpful for students who have specific learning difficulties. Songs, rhyme, movement, clapping, kinesthetic activities, etc. And I would probably use them a bit more with students who are younger. It's not that they are not good for students who are older, but they have, very often adults feel that these are too childish, and then you just spend so much time breaking down these barriers that by the time you have, depending on how much time you have with these students, if it's a short course, then by the time you actually convince them that they are helpful, the course is over. So you would probably do a bit less of the multimodal learning activities with older students, and you would do much more strategy training and awareness raising, because they are much more aware of how they learn and what works for them, because younger children are not consciously using learning strategies, for example. So when I talked about, writing tips and reading tips, etc., vocabulary learning tips, some of the young kids don't use these. They learn a lot through incidental learning and so on. So you need to think about the age group. And then also the other thing that you really need to consider when you're working with adult learners is the story of some of their failures and their low self-esteem and self-confidence, very high anxiety, that sometimes you really have to start the language teaching process with breaking these down and actually dealing with these affective barriers to language learning and trying to raise their self-confidence, lower their anxiety, and so because they have this history of language learning failures.
Thank you very much. That was super interesting. But your time has come to an end.
Okay, good. Thank you for the questions.
And thank you, Sue, for...
Thank you for moderating.
You're very welcome.
Okay, good. Good.
Oh, don't forget to click on leave when you go.
All right. Okay. See you around at the conference.
Indeed.
See you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.